Thank you for coming today. Whoops, I got this set for myself here. I know you all know quite a bit about Van Gogh now after all the lectures that you come to. You've learned about Van Gogh from all points of view, and I thought I'd do something quite different today, and I will talk about pigments that he used. I will refer to Vincent van Gogh, but mostly I'll be presenting stories about different pigments, many of which came into existence during Van Gogh's lifetime, which was during the Industrial Revolution, essentially, in Europe. In this painting that you've already seen in other lectures, from very early in Van Gogh's career, this was done when he lived in a small town in southern Netherlands. Of course, his palette was quite subdued at this time, but less than 2 years later, when he lived in Paris, he had expanded his palette to include the complete range of colors available to contemporary artists, such as the Impressionists. The short answer to the title of my talk is he did not make his colors. He bought them in tubes from an art supply store, much as we would today. He used about 15 different pigments, as far as we know from analyses. Quite a few of his paintings have been analyzed in great detail in museums by conservators and scientists. And as we'll find out more in a few minutes, he wrote a lot of letters where he ordered pigments from his brother Theo, so we know a lot about specific pigments from those too. In Paris, one of his favored art sellers or supply sellers, a place he bought pigments from, was Tanguy. This is a portrait of Tanguy that Van Gogh painted. He did 3 portraits of Tanguy. This is the last one and the most colorful of them. Tanguy was an art dealer as well as a collector and an art supplier. And when Van Gogh moved to southern France, he continued to order pigments from Tanguy. He had his brother Theo purchase them for them and mail them to him. By Van Gogh's lifetime, oil paints in tubes had become available. Not too many years earlier, artists using oil paints would still have had to grind them themselves and mix them with oil in their own studios. Winsor and Newton apparently sold over 100 tenths and tones of oil paints in tubes by the end of the 19th century. That's similar to the number that they sell today. Of course, many of those are mixtures of one particular pigment or 2 or 3 pigments with white. So if you're an artist today, you can simply go and buy 10 or 15 different shades and tints of red, and you don't have to mix much of anything yourself. Same thing would have been true, apparently, in Van Gogh's time. But Vincent van Gogh himself seems to have favored tubes of single pure pigments, and he would mix all his other colors from maybe a dozen or so different types of pure pigments. The MFA's portrait of Augustin Rouland is quite colorful, containing over a dozen different pigments, nearly the entire range of pigments that he used during the last few years of his life from Paris and then in southern France. The portrait of Joseph Rouland seems less colorful overall, but it contains nearly the same range of pigments, although they're distributed quite differently, with an emphasis on blues and greens. The background of this painting actually is made from a mixture of paint from 5 different tubes of paint. And I show a little cross-section down below that's taken from the edge of the background. It shows a single paint layer, and within that paint layer are 2 different green pigments, 2 different blue pigments, and 1 white pigment. And these all certainly came from different tubes of paint. He simply mixed them together to get exactly the particular tone that he wanted. Looking more closely at parts of his portrait of Joseph Rouland, they are quite colorful. For example, if we look at the eye of Joseph Rouland, that's his right eye, the edge of the eye and the surrounding part of the eye, there are 6 or 7 very brightly colored pigments just within the eye. Not so visible if you look at the painting itself with all its greens and blues. As I mentioned, we can learn quite a bit about his preferred pigments while he lived in Arles and the city he moved to later at the end of his life. We can learn from the orders he placed to his brother Theo in Paris, asking his brother to purchase and send these particular pigments to him. This is one page of one of those letters and an English translation of it. There are tubes of 13 different pigments that he requested in this particular order and 1 pigment mixture. And this list only omits one of the major pigments he's known to have used during his last years in southern France. That's ultramarine blue, which is my favorite pigment. But we know he did use ultramarine blue. He just didn't happen to order it in this particular order. Now, for the rest of my presentation, I want to present stories, short stories, so you can tune out the ones that you're not interested in, and about pigments that he used. And I'll divide those into 4 categories. First of all, some of the pigments he used had very long or very, very long histories of use by artists. Artists not only in Europe, but throughout the world. I'll talk about some of those. And then I also will talk about what many people call the world's first modern synthetic pigment, which is still available. The third category would be inventions of the industrial age. The industrial age in Europe is generally thought to have begun about the middle of the 19th century, a little earlier in England probably. And there were many pigments invented. As chemistry advanced at this time, there were many new pigments invented. This gave artists brighter, very different colors to use than earlier artists might have had. And finally, the greatest contribution of chemistry probably during the industrial age was the invention of synthetic dyes, which happened when Van Gogh was a teenager, essentially. And he used a couple of pigments that were made from some of these new synthetic dyes, and I will talk a little bit about the origin of that industry. So let's begin with some of the pigments with very long histories. 3 of them he used were pigments called vermilion, red lead, and white lead, or lead white. Vermilion is a bright red pigment. Red lead is an orangish red pigment, and lead white, of course, is a white pigment. Each of these 3 pigments by Van Gogh's time had been made for centuries synthetically. However, they all have mineral equivalents. And if you go to the right parts, the right geological deposits, you can find deposits of all these different minerals, which you could pick up if that's legal, and you could grind them and use them as pigments. Vermilion has the mineral equivalent, which is called cinnabar, and you see some of it there. The mineral equivalent of red lead is called minium, and the mineral equivalents of lead white are hydrocerussite and cerussite. We all know about the danger of lead paints in houses, particularly here in the Northeast where we have a lot of very old housing stock. And probably the major pigments responsible for those problems would be lead white, which was used in paints up through the 1970s. When it was outlawed, you can no longer use lead white for commercial or house paint, so that you can still buy it as an artist paint. And as that little graph shows, if I can read it, before 1940, close to 90% of the housing stock would have had lead white, possibly other lead paints, but mostly lead white in the paint. And unfortunately, as many of us know, you can find that in little chips of paint that you take from windowsills and walls. The lower layers might be the lead paint, and you don't want your children or your dogs or pets eating those things. And of course, you don't want to plant vegetables outside in your lawn because the paint could have dissolved and then contaminated your soil with lead. Lead is a serious problem and a very dangerous element, and we'll probably never get rid of the pollution that we've introduced from that over the years. And I should say, these 3 pigments, European artists use these, but artists in all parts of the world use these same pigments. You can pick pretty much any country where paintings have been done going back many, many centuries, even millennia, and you will find these 3 pigments being used. The industrial age, which began about the middle of the 19th century in Europe, led to major changes in the lives of people. Some of these changes were certainly for the better, but some were for the worse. And of course, one of the worst aspects of it was probably the pollution introduced by all the factories and the working conditions for people that worked in some of those factories. Here's the beautiful South Wales countryside with new factories spewing smoke, which you probably didn't want to breathe into the air. This little chart, there's a lot going on in this one chart, but the little bar graphs show the approximate date at which some pigments were introduced onto the market, some of the major pigments that Van Gogh used. And there are 8 of those pigments listed there. The one at the bottom, Prussian blue, I'll talk more about in a few minutes. That had been around about 150 years by Van Gogh's lifetime. The other 7 pigments in that chart were all invented after 1800. And some of them, one of them in particular, eosine or geranium lake, was invented only 10 or so, 15 years before Van Gogh actually used it as a pigment. Of these pigments that came into use in the 19th century, 4 of them are still widely available. If you're an artist and you go to an art store, the 4 that you see in the upper left corner of that slide, you can still purchase in oil paints, acrylic paints, watercolor paints, other media. Those are all fairly non-toxic materials, very, very light, stable, very good pigments that many artists utilize. 2 of the pigments that Van Gogh utilized, as did the Impressionists and most other painters in Europe at that time, are very toxic, made of very toxic materials and weren't chemically very stable, so they're not on the market anymore. And I will talk about both of those a little bit more in a few minutes. The pigment at the top, eosine, that eosine is actually the name for a dye, a textile dye, and it was turned into a lake pigment, which was sold as a pigment for artists over a period of a few years. Not very light stable, and you heard about that in the presentation by Lydia Votz and Rachel a few weeks ago, the other conservation presentation, where they talked about the fading of the geranium lake in Van Gogh's painting of Augustine Rouland, and the recolorized version of the flowers in that painting, which tried to bring it back to what it originally looked like. That color was geranium lake. And I should mention something. I know what lake pigments are, but I realize many of you probably don't have a clue what I'm talking about. But if you take a dye, like think of a food color. Food colors are dyes that are soluble in water. They don't have any particulate nature. They're totally dissolved. You can't make a really good pigment out of a dye because it's very transparent and has no real body or texture. But you can take a dye, you can mix it with inorganic chemical elements, oftentimes an aluminum salt, and then you can turn it into a type of particulate inorganic particle to which the dye is attached. So they're colored little particles, and then you can grind those and mix them with oil or watercolor medium or acrylic medium, and then you have a lake pigment. So lake pigments were made as far back as the Roman period, probably much earlier, and they're still very prevalent, and that's how you can take dyes and actually turn them into pigments. And the geranium lake that Van Gogh used was based on the dye eosine that had been turned into a lake pigment by the color makers, the pigment manufacturers. So in my pigment story, I want to first talk about Prussian blue, the one that had been around for about 150 years by the time Van Gogh was born. You can still buy this pigment in art stores and use it, but it's been replaced by brighter blue and other types of blue pigments now in the palettes of most artists. I show some of the paints in the upper left corner there, and the color the Prussian blue looks like when it's pure. It's almost black. It's such an intense color, and it gets to be a very beautiful blue as you mix whites with it. It was often called the first modern synthetic pigment. That doesn't mean that it was the first synthetic pigment, but we've chosen for some reason or the other to call it the first modern synthetic pigment. The earliest synthetic pigment is actually considered to be what we now generally refer to as Egyptian blue. That was invented about 3000 BC in ancient Egypt. It was the only blue pigment used by Egyptian painters. So if you see an Egyptian painting or a painted sculpture in our galleries and it has blue on it, it will have Egyptian blue as a pigment. Egyptian blue went out of use before the Dark Ages in Europe and was only rediscovered centuries and centuries later. And now it has some modern technological uses, but since Van Gogh didn't use it, I can't talk about any of those today. But what is Prussian blue also used for? It's used in histology to stain tissues. I don't really know too much about histology, but it's the study, the microscopic study of tissues used very much in diagnosing health problems and in moving health sciences forward. And in looking at tissue samples, it's often very difficult to see features, so different kinds of stains are used to bring out certain types of cells or structures within tissues. And Prussian blue is one of those stains. And I show this particular picture. I can't tell you what exactly this picture of a tissue is showing here, but the blue areas are ones where the Prussian blue stain was attracted by the features, and it's allowing the diagnostician or the scientist technician looking at the tissue sample to understand something that's going on in that particular sample. That's one major use of Prussian blue today. Another use of it is for treating the ingestion of radioactive cesium and thallium. And that's a prescription drug that you see on the lower right there called radiogardase, which consists of Prussian blue. You would swallow this pill, it would complex with the cesium or thallium that might be in your bloodstream and remove it. basically getting rid of those particular radioisotopes which could continue to do damage in your body. And of course, cesium is used as a radioactive isotope for the treatment of certain cancers. But after it had been ingested, you might want to remove the residual, and Prussian blue would be used for that. And the thallium is something which would be the result of accidental poisoning. And if to remove that from your body, this radiogardase would be the best current solution. So those are a couple of modern uses of Prussian blue. Prussian blue was invented by a Berlin scientist just after 1700, and it was always a very inexpensive pigment during most of its history, and it was also a very strong colorant, meaning that a little bit of it goes a long ways. As I showed a few minutes ago, if you had a solid sample of it, it's almost black. It's such an intensely dark blue. So you can just use a little bit of it to get a fairly dark blue color, or you can mix white with it and get all kinds of shades of blue. And since during most of the time it's been used, it didn't cost very much, it was a very cost-effective material also for many, many different uses. I show here a beautiful little pastel drawing from 1740s. This would have been 20, 30 years after it became commercially available in Europe. And her dress is done with a pastel that had Prussian blue as its colorant. Prussian blue is also the major colorant in the bluish background behind her. Via China, Prussian blue came into Japan, as far as we know, just after 1800. This is nearly 100 years later after it had been invented in Germany. The Prussian blue that came into Japan was exported into China via Europe, and then from China into Japan. For a while in Japan, it was too expensive to be used, except perhaps in certain paintings. But by the 1820s, later 1820s, more of it was available, and it started to be used by some of the Japanese woodblock artists. And there was even a school of woodblock printing called Ijuri A, or E, which I'm probably mispronouncing there. That's the name for the school of woodblock printing in which Prussian blue was the major colorant. It could be the only colorant, it could be the major colorant. Asen is one of the first Japanese artists, perhaps the first one, the first woodblock artist thought to have used Prussian blue in one of his woodblocks. This would have been around about 1830, probably 1829. This is an early Asen woodblock. Most of it's Prussian blue as a colorant. It also has some yellow in it used to make the green in the woman's robe, and also some red to make the red highlights that you see. Another artist working about the same time who used Prussian blue prominently, including some of his prints in which Prussian blue was the only colorant, was Hokusai. This is an early Hokusai, one of his views of Mount Fiji, and this is entirely colored with Prussian blue, the lone fisherman. There are colorized versions of this also, because this woodblock, like many of the woodblocks, were printed in different editions using different colors. So in other words, there's many editions of this particular woodblock print. Some of them are only blue, like this one. Others, made at the same time, would have more colors in them. Prussian blue, probably not surprisingly, was apparently the blue pigment used in Prussian infantry uniforms during the 19th century. Don't know when it started to be used, but during Van Gogh's lifetime, it was certainly what the Prussian infantry's uniforms were made of. And the uniform of Joseph Rouland in our painting, The Postman, is also painted with Prussian blue. It's quite possible that the actual postman's uniform that Rouland was wearing was colored with Prussian blue dye. We don't know that for sure. I tried to research, or several of us tried to find out what postal uniforms were colored with in France at this time, but we couldn't find any information online. Maybe we'll keep researching that and contact some French colleagues just out of curiosity. But it is quite possible that Van Gogh was actually using the pigment to paint his uniform, Rouland's uniform, the actual pigment that was in the uniform, although Van Gogh probably wouldn't have known that. Prussian blue is also the colorant in the photographic process called cyanotypes. Modern photographers using traditional techniques can still do cyanotypes, and some of them still are. This is one from around the turn of the century. And Prussian blue is also the colorant in traditional blueprints. I don't think those things are made anymore, but all of us have probably seen blueprints as designs that were used in the past. That was Prussian blue that made them blue. Now, it's very unusual that lyrics of pop songs contain names of pigments, but this is a song which I was quite fond of in my teenage years by Donovan, and it begins with the line, "Color in sky, Prussian blue." You can go back and listen to that single and actually hear those lyrics. I doubt that Prussian blue was ever mentioned in another song throughout any time in history. And the song's only 2.5 minutes long, so you don't have to listen to it for very long if you want to go back and listen to it sometime. Maybe some of you even remember it. Now, the next pigment I want to talk about is one of the inventions of the 19th century, the Industrial Age. It's called cobalt blue. Although cobalt blue as a pigment is a type of inorganic oxide salt, very chemically stable, the element cobalt has actually been used as a colorant in glass for a very, very long period of time. In ancient Egypt, artists and craftspeople found a blue-colored ore, mineral deposit somewhere, or imported it, and they found out that that could be used to color glass blue. At the left are some excavated pieces of glass from the site of Amarna in Egypt. This dates to 1300, 1400 BC. These are pieces of glass that are colored with the element cobalt. And then the little fish to the right is also made about the same period of time in ancient Egypt. And the blue glass in here, this of course has several colors of glass, but the blue glass is also colored with cobalt. The element cobalt itself was first isolated in 1735, and I think this is kind of interesting. The word cobalt actually comes from a Middle High German word, which translates as underground goblin, perhaps because the ore was difficult to extract from the ground, from the mines that it came from. And some of the earliest sources of cobalt ores in Germany were in mines in Saxony. Now, from what I read, there are actually a few cars that you can buy today that actually have cobalt blue as their pigment. This is not a bad choice because cobalt blue is an extremely stable pigment chemically and very stable to light. So it's not going to change color, it's not going to discolor, it's not going to weather, and it is a beautiful blue color. In fact, Vincent van Gogh talked about cobalt blue, and what he said, you see at the top there, cobalt blue is a divine color, and there's nothing so beautiful for putting atmosphere around things. According to some internet research I did, cobalt blue is one of the colors that you can buy in certain types of Jeep vehicles, like this particular one. It is very striking. I actually saw one of these on the road just last week, and it does have a certain atmosphere around it. Perhaps not the kind of atmosphere that Vincent van Gogh was talking about, but it's a very striking color for a car. And moving on to another pigment that Van Gogh and the Impressionists and artists throughout Europe and America and in other parts of the world used very heavily during the 19th century and into the 20th century. This is a toxic pigment, lead chromate, has lead and chrome in it, both elements that are hazardous and dangerous and toxic. Chrome yellow, the most common name for this pigment, refers to a bright yellow compound that's made from lead and chromium and oxygen. That's the true chrome yellow pigment. There is a natural mineral called crocoite, which has exactly the same mineral composition, and I'm showing some large crystals of that mineral in the upper left. You might say, that doesn't look very yellow to me, and you'd be perfectly correct, not very yellow, but if you took those orange crystals and ground them, they turn into a bright yellow powder. There are many minerals whose color in big crystals is very different than what they're like after you grind them up, and crocoite is one of them. And I learned from my research for this talk that chromium had first been isolated by a French scientist named Vauquelin in 1797, and he actually isolated the element from a sample of this mineral, crocoite. I also learned that the initial chrome yellow pigment that was put on the artist market was made from chromium that came from the mineral crocoite, which was then combined with lead. Even though the mineral itself could have been ground to make the same thing, I think it was rare enough that they only used it to make the chromium, and they had plenty of lead around, so all the lead chromate used as a pigment was made synthetically. It is a bright yellow. There are several different tints or tones of chrome yellow sold on the market, and in the letter that I showed a little earlier where Van Gogh was ordering pigments, there were 3 shades of chrome yellow that he ordered. Now, one of those would have been the pure lead chromate yellow, but the other two were more orangish colored lead chromates, and they were of a little different chemical composition. And not all these lead chromate yellows or yellow oranges were chemically stable or stable to the environment, so they didn't all age as gracefully as each other, let us say. I think you might have seen the buttons in the Postman before in Lydia and Rachel's talk. But the buttons on his uniform, all 8 of them are painted with one of these lead chromate yellows. And this is just a close-up of 4 of the buttons. And Van Gogh apparently painted the blue uniform. He left little white spots, the exposed canvas, where he was going to put the buttons, and then he painted the buttons. He started out by putting, for some reason, an orangish brown pigment down before the blue dried, so as you can see, it's mixed up with some of the blue. And then after that orangish beige color had dried, he put on blobs of lead chromate pigment to represent the buttons. I think you might have seen this slide before too. This is a detail of the forehead of Augustine Rouland from our portrait. That's in the exhibition here from our collection at the MFA. And her face looks a little bit mottled if you look at it. It has a very funny appearance. I mean, admittedly, it never was very realistic skin color, but it has an unusual, not healthy sort of appearance right now. And this is a close-up of her face, and it shows that, in fact, it's mostly painted with lead chromate yellows, but apparently 2 different kinds of them. One is the bright yellow, probably pure lead chromate, that's still in pretty good condition and bright yellow. The other one is one of the other versions of lead chromate yellows that unfortunately turned brownish as it reacted with the atmosphere and the oil medium that it was mixed with. And this is why the passage looks mottled now, because one of the types of chrome yellow has turned brownish now. Those brownish areas are contrasting with the brighter yellow. You also see from this detail, kind of interestingly, that he used green paint to paint the face also in areas. Okay, now we're going to move into the most poisonous and notorious of the pigments that Van Gogh used and other artists during the period of time, and the one with the most frightening stories, I think. And this is the greens that were made out of copper and arsenic. Very, very bright green pigments. The first of them was developed by this particular Swedish-German scientist named Carl Wilhelm Scheele. This is a portrait of him from about 1780 when he was 38 years old. Arsenic itself as a chemical element had been discovered, we think, around 1250, and it's been known as a poison since the 1st century AD. So everyone who worked with arsenic since that time knew that you could kill yourself and anybody else with arsenic if you were playing around with it. Now, Scheele certainly knew it was a dangerous element, but he was experimenting with it, and he in the let's see, what is this called? In the Proceedings or Transactions of the Swedish Academy of Sciences, he published a paper in 1778, and I show part of that paper there, and I can't read that language, but I have a translation of part of that passage, and that's at the bottom of the slide, but I'm going to read it here. He wrote that one can hardly conceive of the help of chemistry in the preparation of colors for painting, and that with its help, that is with the help of chemistry, one can discover new colors again. That's a truth that no one doubts. To comply with the request of the Academy of Sciences, namely that the color green, which I discovered in my experiments with arsenic, as well as its method of preparation, should become more familiar with the public. That's why he's writing this article. He gave the way to make it yourself in the article itself, and he champions it as a new bright green pigment. And it is true that this pigment that we usually call Scheele's green, after his name, was bright green, brighter green than any other green pigment that was available on the market at that time. Scheele knew very well that arsenic was a very toxic element and very dangerous. He knew that this pigment he was making was a potentially very toxic one because of the arsenic it contained. But didn't stop him from introducing it on the market, didn't stop the pigment from becoming very popular because its intense green color was so much stronger than that of other green pigments that were available to artists at that particular time. In the early 19th century, a couple of rather obscure German scientists invented another type of copper and arsenic-containing green that we usually call emerald green. That was more chemically stable than Sheila's green, so it gradually, in fact, probably pretty quickly came to replace Sheila's green as a bright green pigment. Sheila's green was sort of yellowish green in tint. This emerald green was more bluish green in tint. And this is the self-portrait by Van Gogh, dedicated to Paul Gauguin. And the background of this has the emerald green pigment in it. I think you can see the bluish green tint. There's color swatches of it and a little bottle of it to the right there. This is one of Van Gogh's favorite pigments, and it was also a favorite pigment of Impressionist painters and many other painters around the time. Unfortunately, it has a history. Using it as an artist material is okay. It doesn't harm you if it's in a paint and it dries in a paint. So there are many paintings in museums around the world that have these arsenic green pigments in them, and they're not going to harm anybody. They are harmful, and were harmful, however, for other uses which were made of them during the 19th century. Now, I want to move back a little bit to the beginning of the 19th century. Goethe, as most of us know, was a very well-known poet and writer, but he was also a very respected amateur scientist. He wrote a book called The Theory of Colors in 1810. This was a very well-known book during the 19th century discussing color theory, and one realm that Goethe went into and speculated about were the psychological effects of colors. What colors affect how you feel, for example? What colors would you put in the room in your house if you want to feel good or feel comfortable in that room? And he wrote, "The eye experiences a distinctly grateful impression from green. If the two elementary colors, yellow and blue, are mixed in perfect equality so that neither one predominates, the eye and the mind repose on the result of this junction as upon a simple color. The beholder has neither the wish nor the power to imagine a state beyond it. Hence, for rooms to live in constantly, the green color is most generally selected." And it does seem to be true that green was a color commonly used to paint rooms in 19th century Europe. Here's an early painting from 1817 of a woman working in a green room. During the later part of the 19th century, green wallpapers became very common, in England in particular. And during this period of time, later 19th century, the brightest green pigment available was emerald green, this very toxic carboarsenic pigment. And this was used in wallpapers. William Morris was a major figure in the British arts and crafts movement, also a designer, artist, poet, activist, novelist. And he had his own company that sold wallpapers, and here are two of his wallpaper designs. I think he made these designs himself, and his company printed these and then sold them. They would be pasted on walls and houses, and they're loaded with emerald green. That's what the green pigment was in these wallpapers. And although William Morris apparently championed natural colors from natural sources as his colorants, there was no natural green, which was really bright. So he was okay with using this green in his wallpapers, even though by this period of time, the hazards associated with this pigment were very, very well known to many, many people. And this is what Morris had to say about that. "As to the arsenic scare, a greater folly is hardly possible to imagine. The doctors were bitten as people bitten by witch fever." A bit of wishful thinking on Morris's part, and sort of shameful because he certainly knew differently. A Michigan doctor named Robert Kedzie in 1874 published a book called, I can't quite read it, Shadows from the Walls of Death. It was on arsenical wallpapers. He published this book to alert people to the fact that all these green wallpapers sold during the later part of the 19th century had this toxic pigment, this poisonous pigment, emerald green, in them. And this book consisted of samples of 86 different green wallpapers. Apparently 100 copies of this book were printed, but 95 of them were destroyed. They were quite toxic in and of themselves. But 5 remain. I don't know where the 5 remaining ones are. But it's an example of just demonstrating that the toxic nature of these wallpapers is very well known. And this book was published about the same time that Morris was producing these green wallpapers and selling them in England, and having no problem with calling arsenic, the dangers of arsenic, overstated by people that knew better than him. What's even harder to believe is that emerald green was actually used in women's fashions. Green dresses, bright green dresses, became very popular in later 19th century, and emerald green was a pigment used in them because there were no, at least at this period of time, no really, really bright green dyes that you could use for fabrics. And again, the hazards associated with this, very well known and commented on. Punch was a satirical, humorous magazine published in England. This is a cartoon from a 1862 issue of Punch, February 8th, 1862. And it shows a skeletal man in a tuxedo asking for a waltz from a skeletal woman in a dress. And fortunately, her dress has skull and crossbones on it, demonstrating that she was alerting people who were dancing with her that maybe they shouldn't dance with her because she was wearing a poisonous skirt. So the dangers associated with arsenic were very well known. Emerald green was even used for a time to color foods and drinks, astoundingly. Arsenic in other forms, not the green pigment, but in other forms, was used in tonics. There's a tonic potion called Fowler's solution, which contained a little bit of dissolved arsenic salt, not green, but a white arsenic salt, and this was supposed to have been good for your health. It's hard to say whether it was dangerous or not, but it certainly wasn't good for your health, I would say. And that was called Fowler's solution. It was on the market for some number of years. One of the most astonishing products I found while I was doing research for this talk was these beauty products that were sold for women. And I have to read what this advertisement says. Lovely. She was certainly an exquisitely lovely creature. Nothing could have been added to enhance her beauty. She compelled admiration and was an object of worship. This is the universal result of the use of Dr. Campbell's safe arsenic complexion and Fould's medicated arsenic complexion soap. These two world-famous beautifiers transform the most sallow skin into radiant health, remove pimples, clear the face of freckles and tan, give the complexion an indescribable brilliancy. This is a New York advertisement, but it says sold by druggists everywhere. Again, this is not emerald green, but this is an arsenic salts that were put in these particular beauty products and said to have beneficial effects. And then one of the most horrible things that happened during the 19th century in England is that a batch of hard candy was accidentally made with white arsenic salt instead of calcium sulfate. And these were sold, and 21 people, mostly children, I believe, died from eating these candies, and dozens were hospitalized because of poisoning from arsenic. Now, this wasn't intentional. This was accidental, and a guy named William Hardiker, also known as Humbug Billy, was the one that sold them. He was just a seller of these. He bought the candies from somebody else and made them. And the story is that the person that made them got a rush order. One of the people in the shop went up to the attic to get some white powder to put in the candy. The white powder was supposed to be plaster of Paris, but there were two barrels of white powder. One was plaster of Paris, which incidentally is not something you'd want to put in candy, but it was a cheapening agent. It didn't hurt you. It was put in there to cheapen the candy, make it cheaper. The other container was arsenic oxide, white. I don't know what it was doing in this candy maker's attic, but the person took that powder instead of the other white powder, brought it down. The guy making the candy didn't know any different, one white powder from another, and he mixed it in with his candy in those batches, which he sold, and this was the result. Also, apparently, I read that some of these wallpapers had emerald green in them. Of course, they were pasted to the wall with wallpaper paste. Some of these rooms were very humid and damp, and the dampness interacted with the wallpaper paste, and the wallpaper paste was chemically broken down, and one of the gases generated by the bacterial breakdown of the paste reacted with the arsenic-containing green pigment and produced a very toxic gas that had arsenic in them. So that particular gas could be breathed by people in the room with the green wallpaper. So they weren't simply licking or eating the wallpaper green, which I doubt that anybody did very much, except perhaps the occasional pet, or unfortunately maybe a child. But this gas was what was killing people. Today, of course, there are plenty of paintings that still have emerald green in them. Those are not going to harm anybody. There are plenty of wallpapers around from that period of time that have emerald green in them. We know that by analysis. They're handled and stored very carefully. There's no house, historic house you're going to go to that has an emerald green containing wallpaper in it anymore, so there's no houses associated with that. There are, however, many Victorian era book bindings which are green, and they do have emerald green in them. This has probably been known for a long time, but the University of Delaware and Winterton Museum started something called the Poison Book Project a number of years ago to alert people, collectors and museums around the world, about how these green books from this particular era might have emerald green in them. And by handling them, you might get some of it on your fingers. You might dislodge some of the powder. It might get onto desktops or tabletops in your library or your museum. So you might want to be cautious about handling these materials and storing them. That's what this project was about. And we indeed do have some books in our collection which have emerald green in them. And we and many other museums are now carefully re-examining the green books from this era to see if we do indeed have emerald green in them, and then we can store them and alert curators and conservators who are going to be handling them that they do have this emerald green poisonous pigment in them. Now, some pigment names survive to the present day, pigment names that referred to a specific material in the past, but now the name is used to refer to something else entirely. This sort of thing has been happening for a long time, probably all over the place. But one of the strangest ones is this nail polish that I see on the left. It's called Scheele's Green, Scheele's Green. So that's after the name of this first copper arsenic-containing poisonous pigment, which was yellow-green color. Maybe that's where the manufacturers got this idea of naming this thing Scheele's Green. But I doubt that they knew anything about the history of this particular pigment and where the name came from. You can still buy emerald green, but fortunately none of it is this original emerald green, the one that had copper and arsenic in it. It's now something of the same bluish green color perhaps that the original emerald green had, but not toxic anymore. Now the next story, and next to last story I want to go into, is about coal tar colors. Coal tar colors were so named because they started with certain chemical compounds that are in a material called coal tar. Coal tar is made by the thermal destruction of coal. It's a dark, blackish, gooey liquid stuff. It's now used as a sealant on driveways, for example, as you see at the left, and on highways and so forth. It's not particularly toxic for those uses, but it's thought to contain over 10,000 different chemical compounds, and only about half of those have actually been characterized. They're actually specifically identified to date. And at one time, during the 19th century, maybe early in the 20th century, it was thought that some of the vapors given off by coal tar might have healthy effects. So as you can see in the middle picture there was a coal tar vaporizer that you could buy. This was this coal tar, this gooey stuff. You put a little burner underneath it, you vaporize some of it, and the volatile gases that came off, you could breathe them in. They were supposed to be good for you. Notice the label says poison, however, because you're not supposed to drink the material or anything like that, because it was already known that that would be bad idea. Now coal tar can be found in small amounts in certain shampoos, and it does have a positive medicinal effect, some of these compounds that are in coal tar. So there is still a use for it, some uses for it. But it was a relatively new material in the middle of the 19th century, and there was an 18-year-old chemist named William Henry Perkin who was trying to discover a synthetic method of making quinine, which is the compound used to treat malaria. During this period of time, it was only a natural compound. He was trying to figure out a synthetic route to make it, which would make it much more affordable and much more available than the natural material would have been, the natural compound would have been. He was using a particular type of compound found in coal tar, and that one's called aniline, and you see the structure of there. I'm not going to put many of these in this talk, but I had to put this one in anyway. That's what aniline looks like. And by accident, he made a very bright purple pigment, which he named mauve or mauvine. And he realized that he was onto something that he could make a lot of money off of. It could be a textile dye. There was no bright purple pigment or dye that could be used to dye textiles at that period of time. And he had discovered one that he could make reproducibly in his factory using a derivative of coal tar. So he set up his little factory. You see a picture of there at the top. It was a small-scale operation. And for a few years, he made this pigment, made a lot of money off of it. But he unfortunately could not keep up with the much, much bigger factories that were started in Europe to make synthetic dyes. So he went out of business a few years later. But for a while, these bright purple fabrics were very, very popular. Again, it was a bright color, like the bright green from emerald green, that it was a brand new color for fabrics. There was no such thing up until that period of time. And I do want to read this cartoon, again, another one from Punch. I'll read the whole text of this cartoon. This one came from February 17th, 1877 issue of Punch. It's called True Artistic Refinement. The hostess says, "We're going down to supper, Mr. Mirabelle. Let me introduce you to Miss Chalmers." Mr. Mirabelle says, pardon me, is that the tall young lady standing by your husband?" The hostess says, "Yes, she's the most charming girl I know." Mr. Mirabelle says, "I've no doubt, but she affects aniline dyes, don't you know? I really wouldn't go down to supper with a young lady who wears mauve trimmings in her skirt and magenta ribbons in her hair." So this is a reference to this pigment. This is actually, by this time, probably not the pigment that Perkin invented, because his was already out of use by this time. This is a bright purple pigment made by one of these mainland European factories, chemically similar to what Perkin had produced, but a slightly different chemical, but a bright purple. This is a dress that actually is from 1860 that was dyed with Perkin's mauvine, and it's still in very good condition. It obviously was not worn very much because the pigment did fade. It wasn't the chemically most stable pigment that had been made, and some of the later ones were more stable. This is a postage stamp, I think, that was actually colored with mauve, so mauve was used as a colorant, purple color, in other circumstances for a period of a few years when it was available. And although Perkin apparently introduced a lot of pollution into the stream that went by his little factory, he can be legitimately recognized as causing a revolution in the fashion industry. He was the first one that showed it's possible to make inexpensive, extremely bright colored dyes that could be used for fabrics that anybody could afford, as opposed to just wealthy people. Previously, a lot of the better textile dyes and natural ones were very expensive, and only people with a lot of money could afford to buy clothes dyed with those things. That was no longer possible after the synthetic dye industry took off, because there were so many bright colors available, and they were not very expensive. Although, unfortunately, a lot of pollution was probably produced in making those things. Now, the next stage in the production of synthetic dyes was the introduction of these large factories in mainland Europe. And the biggest one of the earliest ones, perhaps the earliest one, is the BASF. Many of you perhaps have heard of BASF. Has anybody heard of the company BASF? What do you know about it?
They make things better.
Okay, you read their website, obviously. They probably do make some things better. I remember they made magnetic tapes for tape recorders when there was such a thing, these big fat tapes on those decked. Okay, that dates both of us, right? But that's what BASF made. But BASF started as a dye producing company. That's how they were started. And the name of that company stands for Badisch, Aniline, and Soda Fabrique. The word aniline, because a lot of these early dyes were based on aniline. They were called aniline dyes, not just coal tar dyes. And it also used soda, which was a compound used to make lake pigments and in the manufacturing of textile dyes. That's what the factory looked like shortly after it opened on the Rhine River in Ludwigshafen, which at that time was a fairly small city in Germany. That's where the international headquarters of BASF still is. BASF today is the largest chemical manufacturer in the world, I believe. They make many, many, many types of products, chemical products. That's what the factory looked like 15 years after it had been founded. You notice that it got a lot bigger, and it's putting out even more pollution in 1881 than it was in 1866. The company is still headquartered in Ludwigshafen, where it started out in 1866. Now, here's the last chemical formula I'm going to show for these organic compounds. But I want to talk a little bit about some of these other coal tar colors. These are other colors. These are colors all invented by BASF in around 1870, slightly earlier, slightly later. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of dye stuffs created of all different colors over a period of very few years. This is really the beginning and fast evolution of the synthetic dye industry. And BASF was not the only company, but one of the biggest ones, the first ones and the biggest ones in existence at this time. And they started with another compound that was in coal tar. This one's called xanthine, and you see it in the upper left. By doing various chemical things to xanthine, you could produce all kinds of colored dyes. One of the colored dyes you could create was eosine, and eosine, as I mentioned, as you've heard previously, is the dye that was turned into a lake pigment that was sold as geranium lake that Van Gogh used. This one was invented by BASF chemists in the late 1860s, I believe, and it came onto the market as a pigment in the 1870s, and a few years after that, Van Gogh purchased it to use, and it was called geranium lake. But it was not very light stable, unfortunately, so it wasn't on the market for that long. Eosine today is used as a histology stain. And so just like Prussian blue, it's used for people that study tissues under the microscope, and it's extremely valuable for that purpose. That's the only purpose it's used for today, but it's invaluable because it will only stain certain types of compounds or cellular structures in tissue samples. Makes it very valuable for that particular reason. Another one that was invented at this time that's chemically sort of similar, you can see the structure looks kind of similar, is something called fluorescein. This was never used as a dye. It's also used in histology. It's extremely important there today. But it also has a very unusual property. If you shine blue light on it, it fluoresces a yellowish green color. So here at the upper right, it was used to trace the movement of water, where two streams of water came together. And this is somewhere in England. And the yellow-green area is where the fluorescein was present, and it was introduced to one flow of water. And sunlight was shining on it, which of course includes blue light, and that caused it to fluoresce yellow-green. And eventually the yellow-green will dissipate. It's not the best thing to put in water, but for a period of years it was used for this kind of purpose. I also read that the Chicago River was dyed with this particular pigment in 1966 on St. Patrick's Day with fluorescein. But shortly thereafter, that might have been the only year it was used because it was recognized that maybe this is not the greatest idea. Maybe we should find something else to dye the river. So other safer, environmentally safer compounds were used. But fluorescein is also used for one very interesting purpose today. In examining the eye doctors will put drops of fluorescein in your eye. They shine a blue light on it. Fluorescein will only attach to certain structures and the cell, the tissue at the front of your eye, on the surface of your eye, and it allows the doctor to see veins and other structures in the surface of your eye that otherwise wouldn't be visible. It's completely harmless to the eye, and yet as a diagnostic tool, it's one of a kind. That's a major use for fluorescein today. The one at the bottom is erythrocene, and we might know it better as FD&C red number 3 or red dye 3. And no matter what you might think of Kennedy and the present US government, he wants to eliminate synthetic food dyes from US food products, and that may be one of the few things that we really can 100% support, at least I can 100% support. And this has been suggested for many years by very many people. In Europe, the use of this particular dye in food products and cosmetic products was outlawed many years ago. The use of this dye in cosmetic products was outlawed in the United States a number of years ago. It's never been outlawed in foods, although I believe California just outlawed it, so within a couple of years, companies that still use it to dye food, like candies and things like that, will not be able to sell their products in California because the dye will not be legal to be sold in California. But by then, it might be illegal in all the US. And some people are complaining that it's a bright red color. It's hard to get bright red colors that you use in foods. I would say too bad, and many other people would say too bad. But there's a reason to think it's hazardous to health. Maybe not in the amounts it's used in food products, but there's no reason to have it being used in food products anymore, I believe. So probably won't be around very much longer. But it was invented at the same period of time as eosine and fluorescein and all these other xanthine-based compounds. And it was a textile dye for many years. Never used as a pigment in paintings, as far as I know. But we've looked at samples of geranium lake from Van Gogh paintings, as have other laboratories. We've looked at it under the microscope and chemically, and we find little bits of erythrocene floating around in the geranium lake. That's because the color maker bought the eosine from some big chemical company like BASF. BASF made all kinds of compounds, and some of one compound just got its way into the bucket of another compound, so the geranium lake had a little bit of erythrocene in it. And erythrocene has iodine in it, eosine has bromine in it, very easy to determine those things by the chemical analysis means we have. So that's something about these earlier dyes. This is a page from a book. We have a book upstairs. Many people have copies of this book. It's a 1901 BASF catalog, sort of all the dyes they sold. Must have 100 or more different dyes that they were manufacturing at the time. And it has all these color samples of the dyes on silk, on linen, on cotton, on other fabrics. And in the middle row are the eosines at the left and erythrocene, the FD&C red number 3 that I just mentioned in the middle column. So these are just some of the colors that BASF sold as textile dyes in 1901. And you've already seen our Augustine Roland portrait in the recolorized version that Rachel and her colleagues in conservation did on the flowers and the wallpaper of that painting. But Geranium Lake is faded much more dramatically in some other Van Gogh paintings, and this is just one of them. This one's in the Guggenheim collection. The detail at the upper right shows the detail of the area as it looks now on the left, and on the far right, a recolorized area showing how changed the purple passages are in this particular painting. There are some pink bushes in the background. The pink is totally gone. They're now almost pure white. And there were purples in the ground plane, and the red has gone away and they're now blue. So major color changes, and not subtle in this painting. They're a little more subtle in our La Berceuse painting that we have in the gallery. I just show this because it's a little more dramatic than the example we had included in the exhibition, and there are many examples like this among Van Gogh's paintings. Now, many of you might say, what if I want to make eosine in my kitchen at home, or my small chemistry lab at home? Probably not your kitchen unless you have a good fume hood. You can do it. There's a YouTube video that tells you how to make eosine from fluorescein, which you can easily buy from many companies, this difluorescein, and you need a few simple chemicals, and you can make the stuff yourself, make eosine yourself. Not sure why anybody would want to do that, but you can do that. And you can learn how to do it safely on this particular website. I've watched a lot of do-it-yourself chemistry videos by this guy, and they're really pretty interesting if you get into that kind of stuff. I think you saw this picture in Lydia and Rachel's presentation a few weeks ago. She showed the postman, and the conservatives use ultraviolet radiation to look for certain pigments in paintings and condition of paintings. And it's very good for showing where Geranium Lake is in paintings like La Berceuse because it fluoresces bright pinkish red. Now, there's a bright pinkish red fluorescing pigment in this painting also, but it's not Geranium Lake. It's a whole nother lake. And in fact, in the postman, there's no Geranium Lake used. Van Gogh didn't always use exactly the same paintings in all his paintings. Maybe he only used 15 different tubes of paint, but he didn't use all 15 in a given painting. And why he chose to use Geranium Lake in La Berceuse and not in this painting from within a year of the other painting, I don't know. And why did he choose to use a particular fluorescing red in this painting that he didn't use in La Berceuse? We don't know that either. Maybe he ran out of a particular tube of paint at one particular period of time. There could be a reason simply as simple as that. He was pretty poor. He didn't always have all the supplies he needed. So that could have gone into some of his decisions of what he would use in a given painting because he painted so quickly. Sometimes only a matter of a few days to do some of these paintings. What is that fluorescing red pigment? Well, we looked at a little sample. This talks not about it's not about science. It's not about what I do in my lab. So I keep all that out of this. But I'll show one little microscopic picture here of a sample from the postman. That's a bit of this really bright red fluorescing pigment. And we were able to show with different types of analyses that it contains two different natural red lakes. These are red lakes that came from plants, not from some chemical factory. One of them was made with aluminum as its substrate, and one of them was made with tin as a substrate. The one that fluoresces was made with aluminum. And we think the one made on aluminum was rose madder. Rose madder is a plant that you see here on the left. It has very bright red roots. if you dry these roots out and then use the centers of the roots, there are 3 or 4 or 5 different very bright pinkish red compounds that you can get from the roots. All you have to do is soak the roots in water, or better yet in alcohol, and you'll get this really, really bright crimson solution. And that makes a very good textile dye called rose madder. And textile artists, textile makers who still like to use natural dyes will still use madder. It's fairly stable chemically into light. And you can buy it in artist pigment still. It's usually called alizarin because that's the name of the major red colored compound in the natural matter. But alizarin in 1868 was first synthesized in a lab by a BASF chemist, of course. And now alizarin used to make pigments is probably the synthetic one, not the one that comes from the plant roots. It's much easier to make it in a chemical factory, which these days is probably in China than it is to get the roots of the plant and extract it from the plant. And just about a month or two ago, some archaeologists published a paper about some beads, some shell beads they had discovered in a cave in Israel on the coast of the Mediterranean. These beads are about 15,000 years old, and they were dyed pink with madder from the rose madder plant. Thus, rose madder was one of the earliest pigments used in history by our ancestors, as far as we know at this point in time, earlier than any of the other pigments I've talked about, even the really old ones with long histories like lead white and red lead and vermilion. Long before that, probably. And the other red pigment in that lake pigment, the brighter red one that didn't fluoresce, we think that's probably from Brazil wood. Brazil wood is a type, comes from a type of tree that is native to Brazil. It's now an endangered species, but the center of that tree is bright red, as you can see in this cross section here. And that's where the pigment came from, the heartwood of the tree. You can extract this beautiful red pigment, and it was used as a textile dye, usually called Brazil wood, obviously. And the country of Brazil, by the way, was named after the wood, not vice versa. The wood, the name refers to the red color of this particular tree. And Brazil wood apparently is the best wood to make the bows for string instruments from at the moment still. It's still used for that purpose. But since the tree is an endangered species, it's thought that maybe within a few years that's going to be outlawed, and the people that make bows for string instruments are not going to be able to use Brazil wood anymore. They're going to have to use something else, which they're very upset about and they begin lobbying about already. But at the moment, they're still using that. That's the last slide I have, and I'll just leave you with this little detail from the postman. There are 5, 6, 7, 8 of the 14 or so pigments in the postman, all within this little area. That's the edge of his hat, and the yellow ribbon around his hat, one of those bright red areas of this madder lake, and then the background had the 5 different pigments in it. And then finally, since ultramarine blue is my favorite color, I'm going to end with this. In ultramarine blue, it was a synthetic pigment during Van Gogh's lifetime, but it came from a natural source, the lapis lazuli stone. That's where the earliest ultramarine used in Europe came from. Ultramarine, or the lapis lazuli, was known in ancient Egypt as a stone, and it's a very rare stone, not found in many parts of the world. So you don't find natural ultramarine as a pigment anymore, but you can find plenty of synthetic ultramarine, which is the same thing chemically, and I happen to feel is an extremely beautiful pigment. And we do have time for questions, and I am happy to answer any kind of question, even if only remotely related to anything I talked about today. Any questions? Yeah.
Hold on one second.
I have what will be, I think, a naive question.
Okay.
Did artists mix yellow and blue to create greens?
Of course.
Okay.
Actually, yes, that's been done also by textile dyers for a long time. Okay. You do a yellow and a green, yellow and a blue together to make green, right? And on that list of pigments that from the letter he wrote to his brother Theo, I didn't mention it, but the last one he ordered was actually a mixture of a yellow and blue pigment. It was sold as a green pigment, but it was a mixture of Prussian blue and chrome yellow. That's one of the few mixed pigments that we think he bought. There were all kinds of mixed pigments on the market at that time, but Van Gogh seemed to prefer pure pigments. But that's one mixture that he bought and apparently used in his paintings, that particular green mixture too. So yes, you can do that. And today, if you buy greens in artist stores, if you read the labels, some of them are probably made from a yellow and a blue pigment mixed together, because the green you could get might be a little different than that of some of the green pigments you could actually buy that are pure green pigments. Yeah.
Thank you. I have a question about the stringiness. Like even on this, you can see where it's like dragged. Was that the pigment? Was it because they made the paints differently when they started out, or did he add something? Or was that the lead white that was thick and stringy from?
Well, I don't know how many of you have used tube oil paints that you get out of a tube. You know they're these it's a thick gooey material, right? If you squeeze a blob of it out on a palette, it sits there as a blob. It doesn't spread out. It's not liquid like liquid acrylic paints or like a thin watercolor paint. Of course, you can thin oil paints down into very thin glazes, but if you use them right out of the tube, they're very thick and viscous. And if you put a blob of it down, it will stay as a blob. It will dry as a blob of paint. But the consistency of oil paints, it varies depending on the pigment and the amount of pigment compared to oil that you mix with it. So I think some of the tubes of paint that Van Gogh bought probably have paint with different textures in it. Some of them were more viscous than others. If he took the paint right out of the tube, he put a lot of it on a brush, and then he dragged that brush over the top of another color underneath, it would leave a thick streak. You could still see sort of the way the brush moved. It would be thicker or thinner in areas depending on where he dragged it. And if the paint underneath was still wet, as it often was because he worked so quickly, then the paint underneath, if it wasn't dry, would mix with that other color. So he got what you might call accidental colors by mixing something down below something else that he probably didn't care about, but he just worked so quickly, it didn't bother him. And then the red, the bright red pigment, Geranium Lake and the other lake that he used, they have a different kind of texture. I think because the lake pigment was transparent, more transparent than the other one. They have a kind of buttery consistency. They look a little different on the surface of the painting. If you look at them in detail, you can't see that except without a microscope to examine them. They look a little different. So part of what you're asking about probably has to do with the texture of the paint coming out of the tubes. Part of it with how he drew it across the surface of the tubes, the size of brushes he used, how much paint he put in the brushes. And some have to do with the paint itself that came out of the tube. He probably used turpentine to thin some of his paints, but there's no indication that he used a lot of thinning with his paints, just by looking at his paintings. Yeah.
Here, would you mind just speaking to the mic?
Sorry, second question. Did he always work in one day or before the paint dried, or did he put some paintings to the side and they dried on the first layers?
Could be both.
Picked them up?
Could be both. It takes days for oil paint usually to dry. If it's a relatively thin oil paint layer, it would take days before it's dry to touch. In other words, you can put your finger on oil paint after a couple of days. If you use oil paint today, it'll still come off in your finger. It takes a few days to get solid. Once it gets solid, then you could put paint on top of it and you won't be dragging away the paint underneath. If the original paint layer was pretty thick, it takes much longer for it to get dry to your finger. Sometimes Van Gogh worked so quickly that the paint underneath wasn't dry. Other times he worked more slowly, and he would do paintings in a day or two. Sometimes he would start a painting and then finish it some days later. So some of the paint was put down while underlying paint was wet. Some of the paint was put down after underlying paint was dry. But that could have been all over a period of, let's say, a week. But if you did the whole thing in a day, everything would have gotten all jumbled and mixed up because it doesn't dry quickly like acrylic paints or watercolor paints do. Oil paints.
I have a question that came through the online folks watching. Did Van Gogh's palette include a warm and cool version of the primary colors, as is typical of many artists painting today?
A warm and cool version
of the primary colors.
Well, let's take blue, my favorite color. I would say ultramarine is on the cool side because it has a slight violet tinge to it. At least that's the way my eye sees it. Cobalt blue, on the other hand, has a slight greenish tint to it. that puts it on the more warmer side. You know, if you have blue here in the electromagnetic spectrum, here's violet right next to it. Here's red at the far end of the electromagnetic spectrum over here, and yellow's in between. So if you seem to mix a tiny amount of yellow with blue, you get a very slightly greenish blue, which is what I would call cobalt blue compared to ultramarine blue. So those are warm and cool. So he used 3 different blue pigments, Prussian blue, ultramarine, and cobalt, and one of those was on the warmer side than the other one. And he used these different tints of lead chromate yellows, and one of them was more on the orangey side, and one of them was more on the bright yellow side. You could call the bright yellow one cooler because it's closer to the blue end of the spectrum, and the orangish one closer, a warmer one because it's close to the red end. So I would say, yes, he was very sensitive to colors, and even though he may only use 12, 13 different pure tube colors, he would mix them up in different ways to get exactly what he wanted. So I think he was very well aware of that, even though I don't think he talked a lot in detail about cool and warm in his letters that I'm aware of anyway.
Thank you.
Okay.
I was thinking about the background you gave on the toxins in paint, including arsenic, and whether there's any correlation to his, mental state or anything like that because of the exposure to all that paint.
Everybody asks that question. It's a very reasonable question to ask considering the history of poisoning from arsenic green. But the poisonings that are known happen because of dresses that were, or wallpaper, or drinks that had the arsenic green in it. I'm not sure there's any painter that's ever been poisoned by emerald green pigment. You would have to literally eat it because it's mixed up. He bought it in a tube mixed with oil. He's not going to be breathing any of the vape. He's not going to be chewing on it. So there's really no indication that he had any kind of exposure to arsenic as a toxic chemical. So yes, it was a poisonous pigment. For that reason, you can't buy it anymore. It's not sold as an artist pigment, just like red lead and vermilion and things like that with hazardous toxic heavy metals in them. But I don't think there's any indication that his mental or physical problems had anything to do with poisoning from pigments that he was using. I should say that there is a story about Napoleon possibly being poisoned by arsenic in wallpapers or paints in the house that he was, what's the word for it, exiled to. There's indications that he was slowly poisoned by arsenic in the green rooms there, and that probably is a true story. Might not have been responsible for his death, but he probably suffered something from that. And Sheila, the guy that invented Sheila's green, made from arsenic, he died when he was in his early 40s, and some people think it's probably in part because he was exposed to arsenic fumes during his experiments. He knew arsenic was dangerous, but there weren't fume hoods and regulations about carefully using toxic materials, and he would have been exposed to certain vapors during his lifetime as a chemist there. So, but I don't think I've heard that any artist actually died from emerald green poisoning. And Van Gogh certainly, I don't think anybody really thinks that had any effect on his health. Any other questions?
All right. Thank you so much for coming today, and
You're very
thank you for the wonderful lecture.